Today I'm sitting down with Marina Dickson. She's a research associate here at the Asia Pacific Initiative, and Sara Kaizuka, who teaches at Musashino University. Thanks for joining us, guys. And you are the authors of an upcoming report on disinformation. What is disinformation and why does it matter?
Okay, so thank you so much for having us. In terms of disinformation, so the intent is intentional. There's an intent to mislead individuals. The content itself could be false or the distorted truth.
So how significant is this? You describe that, we're in the year of elections. A lot of developed economies are experiencing changes in leadership and political campaigns. We've been doing a podcast ourselves on this topic throughout the year. Where does disinformation come into all of this?
Well, I think there's a tendency to think that disinformation is a relatively new phenomenon, and certainly we are inundated with it a lot more than we used to be maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And part of that is with how quickly it can spread, especially on online platforms, and how many actors can be involved in it very easily and with a pretty low cost barrier. But actually, disinformation has been around a long time. And for this report, I was focused on the US chapter. And there I talk about how there was disinformation as early as the presidential election between Jefferson and Adams. So it's been around for a long time. And it's always had this intent to, like Sara said, mislead or sometimes just cause enough confusion that voters might not know what to believe in an election, what information to trust. And so that idea of trust in what information they can take in or the trust they might have in their governments or the outlets that are providing the information, I think that's what really plays into its impact on elections.
Yeah, so to just jump into that, as Marina said, disinformation's been going for a very long time. What's different now is that there's the technology to enable the spread of disinformation much faster than we used to see in the past. Another thing to point out is that disinformation itself doesn't have to be that sophisticated. So you can have a half-baked disinformation campaign that will be rapidly spread around. It doesn't have to be extremely sophisticated to penetrate people. So in that sense, one of the difficulties we're having is what the Rand Corporation call a fire hose of falsehood, where there's a lot of disinformation being spread, and it's really difficult for people to tackle individually.
So you've divided this report up into 3.5 case studies, let's call it. You focus specifically on Hungary, the United States, United Kingdom, and then you close with some words for Japan. We can call that half a case study, I suppose. The author of the Hungary report isn't with us today, so let's focus on the US and UK dimensions. Give me some examples of what kind of disinformation tactics you've seen. What are the methods? What are the goals? And I guess to the extent that you're able, does this work or not?
So to provide the UK's example, I focused on Brexit and the claim that there's £350 million a week that goes to the European Union could be better spent on the national health services in the UK. So this was a slogan that was used by the Vote Leave campaign. One of the real difficulties with this slogan was that it had partial truths. So it used official data from the Office for National Statistics. So it's very difficult to debunk that claim through using data, because when you say it's 350 million, the only thing you can say is that it's a little bit lower than that. So the problem with this claim is that people already had the image that there was too much money going to the European Union from the United Kingdom. And that claim validated that perception. But in order to debunk that, you had to go through the details of the figures, which is very difficult for people to understand.
So just to jump in quickly,
Yes.
In your report, you describe this as an example of an engagement trap.
Yes.
Correct? What is an engagement trap, and how did this example of EU funding demonstrate how this can work?
So in my chapter, I define the engagement trap as a specific disinformation tactic which twists the truth and makes it emotionally engaging to maintain maximum engagement with the aim of spreading a narrative that is beneficial to the perpetrator. So with this engagement trap as a concept, one of the difficulties I found in trying to explain the £350 million claim was that it's sort of half of the truth, but it's also not perfectly true as well. And to me personally, trying to debunk that was quite hard. And I realized that by trying to explain it, I was getting muddled into the figures. And I realized that that was exactly what was happening with the Remain campaign back in the 2016 EU referendum. And Dominic Cummings, who was the person who was responsible and working for Vote Leave campaign, specifically said in an interview that that was specifically his goal of trying to entangle the people who were supporting Remain by using official data. And that was a specific tactic that he had.
Sort of trap them in a net that by arguing the specifics so much, they would stop talking about the bigger narrative, the bigger picture. This was a deliberate tactic by Dominic Cummings.
This was a deliberate tactic, yes.
And would you say that it worked?
Yes, I think it did work because some of the survey data in 2018, I believe, found that people still, a significant proportion of the public still believed this claim. So that was, after years of trying to be debunked, people still had that notion that this was true.
So let's turn to the United States next. You talked about how disinformation has been in campaigns going all the way back to Adams and Jefferson. So this isn't new. And I know I'm going to be enough of a history dork to have to stop myself from asking about the disinformation campaign in Jefferson Adams. But again, sort of similar question, like, does this work? Are there methods that you might say, quote unquote, are uniquely American? And who are some of the audiences that might be especially receptive to these kinds of tactics?
Yeah, so there's quite a few aspects to unpack in all those very good questions. I would say it's hard to say if there's sort of tactics that are unique to the United States because you have to break down the actors into foreign actors and domestic actors. So if you're looking at foreign actors, especially if you're looking at some of the most infamous influence operations, they're called active measures. These active measures that were perpetrated by the Soviet Union, for instance, they tend to come up with slightly more sophisticated campaigns. So one of the ones that I discussed in the chapter was Operation Denver, which was essentially this idea that the United States had created the HIV virus in a lab in Maryland, and they were able to spread that idea to a conference at the non-aligned movement. And because it was able to spread to sort of more, neutral parties and spread through that corridor, once it went back to the United States, once it reached back to the United States audience, it seemed a little bit more believable because you knew that it wasn't necessarily coming from an adversary.
There was a degree of separation.
Correct, exactly. Another one that the Soviets came up with was during the LA Olympics, I believe in 1984. They basically pretended to be the KKK and tried to send these leaflets out to countries with, minority representation, so Asian countries, African countries, and tried to tell them that you're not invited to the LA Olympics and you can't attend, and if you do, that you would get lynched. And obviously this wasn't true, and the KKK was being monitored by the police anyway, so the police knew that it wasn't done by the KKK. And that one didn't end up working. Those country representatives ended up participating regardless. But there is a tendency for foreign actors to use the cleavages that already exist in U.S. domestic society and try to use that to their advantage to create chaos or spread disinformation that can be beneficial to the Soviets, maybe indirectly, just by sowing discord within U.S. society itself.
So you talked about foreign adversaries, foreign actors. What about domestic actors?
So there are, of course, a lot of domestic actors, and I think we have a tendency to blame foreign actors a little bit too much, especially nowadays, because the barrier to entry is so low in terms of being a disinformation spreading actor. So you probably remember late last year, there was that whole robocall issue with the Biden campaign in the New Hampshire primary, where there was this fake voice of Joe Biden saying to save your vote and don't vote for me in the New Hampshire primary and just save it for the general election. And that was being done by a organizing group that was affiliated with the Republican Party. And obviously it doesn't cost a lot of money to make robocalls to random numbers of voters. So there's that aspect. There also sometimes is another way where it seems like something might be coming from a foreign actor, but actually it's usually started by a domestic actor. So there was this claim that Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene had said that the U.S. aid for the war in Ukraine was actually being used by President Zelensky to buy yachts. And that got picked up by the Russian media, and they started spreading it. And then somehow J.D. Vance, who is now the vice presidential candidate, also started saying it. And people would say, well, that's actually a Russian talking point. But actually, it wasn't a Russian talking point. It was actually a domestic
Marjorie
talking point.
Taylor Greene talking point.
Exactly. So if you sort of trace back to the origins of it, sometimes you find that things that you think are, foreign actors to blame actually started domestically.
But that kind of ties back, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this kind of ties back to intentionality, doesn't it? Because don't want to badmouth Marjorie Taylor Greene if she's a listener, but that is the kind of thing that she might say just because she doesn't know any better. She might not intend to throw a chunk of disinformation, to throw a Russian talking point out there. So it does kind of beg the question, how do you define how do I put this exactly? How do you define the intentionality behind disinformation? How can you say, that you're going to have clear instances like Dominic Cummings with the engagement trap, but then you have other instances like this. So how are you able to define when something is deliberately, consciously being put out there to throw people off?
So I think in terms of the example that I raised that was domestic and then foreign both interacting together, I don't think necessarily that Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene was saying that to mislead voters or constituents of hers per se. She might have just been saying that because that was something that she believed or something that she had heard. I think for the Russians to pick that up and then start putting that out on their own media outlets, there's a clear intention there to get more U.S. audience members to hear that point. Even if they don't 100% believe it, there's enough there for them to sort of distrust the Biden administration's handling of U.S. aid to Ukraine. And that alone sort of creates the seed of distrust or doubt in their confidence of the government itself.
Sort of pushing at an open door. Right. And in the case of Dominic Cummings, Sarah, you said that you said, I think, outright that, yes, I was trying to throw you guys off the scent, and congratulations, you took it.
Yes, he did say that in a BBC interview, actually, with Laura Koinsberg. So that was a very rare example, I'd say, of somebody being that forthright about their intentions. But as you point out, that doesn't happen that frequently. So with that example, I was able to point out a video clip. But in most cases, it is up to the researcher, or it is up to the individuals listening to it to define whether or not that there is a clear intention. You can never know what people are thinking in their heads. So it will be, sometimes it's a guesswork, but perhaps if there's enough sufficient evidence to suggest that there is an intention, then you can point out that this is in fact disinformation. If you can't prove that, there's also, you can define as misinformation, where there isn't a specific intent to mislead, which is a little bit different from disinformation.
So if you're a government or you're a private citizen, let's stick with the private citizen. If you're a private citizen, how do you discern disinformation from actual information?
I think that's getting increasingly difficult. And obviously with the increasing use of AI in a lot of presidential campaigns or political campaigns in general, it's easy to create or deep fakes, or what now they're calling cheap fakes, where you have a photo of a representative, somebody running for political office in a compromising way, or doing something that they didn't do, or saying something that they didn't do. Now there's the opposite of that, where a candidate might say, "Oh, that's just a deep fake. It's not really true, and maybe it is legitimate." So I think it's getting much more difficult to discern what is real and what is not, and that is on the responsibility of a bunch of different actors, both government and private actors, private sector actors, to really try to hone in on, I guess, certain measures they could take to control the use of AI in political campaigns. The Federal Election Commission said that they were going to create new rules over the summer before the big election upcoming next week, or the November U.S. election. And there was a lot of anticipation for them to come up with new rules that would really address this, and they ended up not doing anything. And so I think that was very disappointing, and there's definitely a need for that to, a need for tighter regulations in the future, and before it really gets out of control.
Yeah, to just jump into that, if you're going to look at Japan's case, so one of the motivations that we had in writing this report was provide some kind of policy recommendations for Japan. At the moment, in the case of Japan, the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications are requesting social media platforms or companies that are developing AI technology to provide support in the upcoming election, or they also requested this support right after the Noda Peninsula earthquake, when there was a spread of disinformation. So, but at the moment, we are quite constrained in what we can do, so it's a request-based. So we do recommend in our report, through our report, that perhaps that strong regulation is perhaps necessary, of course with the caveat that you need to make sure that you protect freedom of expression, but it is increasingly becoming difficult to just rely on the private sector to deal with it. And I think that in some cases the private sector would be very much happy to have more cooperation with the public sector and the government to try and bring in regulations so that they can make the online community safer.
What would you say are some examples of successful pushback? What methods have you defined or identified that might be applicable to other cases? You talked briefly about reports, recommendations for Japan, but what about more broadly? What are some examples that you've drawn from in your case studies, UK and United States, that you think might be broadly applicable to other countries that may also be facing this kind of challenge?
So in the UK chapter, it's not necessarily just about the UK, but I do bring up the point that perhaps use of humor, or the reverse use of the engagement trap via the use of humor and memes could be quite an effective way of combating disinformation. I do provide the example of NAFO, which is an online community of basically based on volunteers, people who want to combat disinformation, especially coming from Russia. This became quite popular after the Ukraine war in 2022. And with them, they're not, with debunking disinformation claims, they're not trying to go for the usual fact-checking that we see, which takes quite a long time, quite a lot of resources. With them, they are posting small memes, for instance, on X, or formerly Twitter. And sometimes they're quite successful in getting the the Russian individuals who are spreading the disinformation to then talk to them and have a comeback.
Oh, interesting.
But that is also something that they're looking for, because then they could point out how silly it all is that these quite serious people are responding to memes. So that's quite a good way of discrediting the source material itself. And I provide that as potentially an example of combating disinformation.
Anything from the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different things I think are applicable to other countries, not just the US. One of them is obviously the regulation of tech firms that have a lot of control in how this disinformation spreads on their online platforms. And the EU is more ahead than the US on that in terms of trying to crack down on big tech conglomerates that are not doing enough to spread disinformation or to stop the spread of disinformation. Aside from that, I did include some recommendations on media literacy education. So the point of comparison that I made was with Finland, where they have mandatory media literacy education from a very young age in elementary school, and they are taught to discern what is true from what is false from a very young age. And they've also
young age, you say, you're talking like preschool in some cases, right?
Yeah, maybe
preschool,
elementary school,
kindergarten, that early.
Yes, and obviously Finland, being on the border with Russia, has been the victim of disinformation campaigns from an adversary as well. So they're kind of in a similar boat where they know that this is, could be deeply damaging to society if they don't have a population that is good at discerning truth from false. Meanwhile, in the United States, now there's 4 states that have mandatory media literacy education. I think California just introduced it this year.
Okay.
But that's, 46 states to go. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think.
Okay. Sara Kaizuka, Marina Dickson, thanks so much for joining us. And obviously this is going to be an issue that will not go away anytime soon. So thank you for your report. I encourage all of our listeners to check it out once it's out there. And to our guests, thanks once again. Keep up the good work.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.